So this past week, in the most recent, was it episode 6 or episode 7? It was Orgies in the Graveyard was the episode of it. I know that. But in the episode of Sex and Science Hour, I talked about Max Stiner during the after show where we cover the Amazon purchases, because somebody bought Max Stirner's The Ego in Its Own. Stephanie asked me to sum up as quickly as I could, like what is Max Stirner getting at? What is he pushing or putting out there? And so I talked about that. And I've talked about Max Stirner for years. I talked about it back when I was on Free Talk Live years ago. I said The Ego in Its Own is the best book on anarchism available today. There might be one better out there. There might be one that's on par. How about I say that? And I think I mentioned it during the Sex and Science Hour episode, but it's Michel Onfray's the Hedonist Manifesto is just a brilliant little book. And in fact, he uses one of his examples of how to organize as anarchists is the union of egoists, which is what Max Stirner talks about in The Ego in Its Own. And he said, like, this is just the most brilliant, organizational tool that's ever been devised. And I agree. I've been saying that forever, is that no, the way you set up any kind of society is through a union of egoists, which can vary in size. It doesn't have to be, it could be small, it could be large. But you do it under the auspices of what a union of egoists, means. So anyway, the question I got about Max Stirner, because I do talk so prominently about him, was on Twitter, and I'll answer it here. Would you consider Max Stirner a libertarian, even though property rights wasn't part of his philosophy, which emphasizes individuality? So that's a great question to bring up. Okay, so first off, like, Stirner isn't perfect. Who is? But like, even egoism, which is egoist anarchism, which is Stirner's philosophy, still is left with much to be desired. And I think everybody kind of knows that. And that's why so many people point to The Ego in Its Own as like just this foundational text that everybody sort of builds off of. Like, even Marx built off of it. Rothbard even built off of it. Benjamin Tucker built off of it. Lots of people built off of Stirner's works. And they give credit where credit's due. Now, of course, sometimes when these people build off of it, I think they severely misinterpret, what Stirner had to say. But regardless, he is a foundational kind of character, sort of like a Herbert Spencer, right? Herbert Spencer is another character who I also enjoy, and interestingly, also was very wishy-washy on property rights, but who gets pointed at as, in many ways, the first libertarian, and gets held up as, like an incredible philosopher, among other things. So, now, would I consider Max Stirner libertarian? No. I would not. Now, let's be clear, to address the more specifics of this, quick Twitter question. Max Stirner's stance on property rights is that he didn't hold a hard dogma on them. Okay, and that's almost his exact words, is that he didn't have a hard dogma. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't think property rights weren't useful. His concern is that property rights, and I'll tell you something, I agree with this, and I've talked about it before on Sovryn Tech, is that property rights can become their own tyranny. Like, property rights can become such a big deal, like that they can become, they can be held up as a god. And I think a lot of libertarians and anarcho-capitalists do this, to where they become harmful to human growth and the human condition in general, and harmful to the individual. I think, and this is kind of, for me, kind of my jumping off point on contracts, is that what happens with contracts is when everything is based upon, voluntary contracts, well, even if they're voluntary, who's the enforcement body? And also, like, how do you agree on these various contracts? Like, the example that I give often enough is that if you have land, now there's kind of an answer to this, but I'm going to give the example. Okay, is that, and this is based off of a comedic story that people tell, but this is what I use to explain it. Okay, if somebody bought land from some, Libertarian Landowners Incorporated or some bullshit, okay? You bought it from them. You go to that land, and and you find that there's like some kind of a squatter or somebody perhaps that has been developing there. Maybe it's like 50 some odd acres, some crazy amount of acreage, and there's somebody that's been working, living there and working there. I don't know, for 10, 20 years. The time frame really doesn't matter. And you go up to him and say to him, hey, I bought this land from Libertarian Landowners Incorporated. Get the hell off of my property. Okay, but did this guy, did this squatter, we'll say, whatever, like, did he agree to that? And in fact, like, what's the situation here? Like, what's the deal? Like, if this guy's on there and he's developed and all this stuff, I mean, then you run into homesteading issues and all this. It becomes an interesting philosophical problem. And the answer to that is that, in some ways, the answer for ANCAPs or for libertarians is that, Libertarian Landowners Incorporated would, there'd be an escrow, as in there'd be a penalty if he found out within, say, a certain amount of time that the land he was getting was not what Libertarian, that the individual was buying from Libertarian Landowners Incorporated was not what Libertarian Landowners Incorporated described. Okay, so you could set up maybe like a multi-sig cryptocurrency. We're talking about libertarian paradise here. Okay, you could set up some kind of multi-sig where that person would get their money back, or they'd get some kind of deposit back or something once he finds out, oh shit, there's this guy on here, I don't want to kick him out, or this isn't exactly what I signed up for. However, it all shapes up. Like that's sort of how you would do that. Is technologically, that's how that would get solved. But what if the guy doesn't want to give it up? Like, who does that really belong to? Does it belong to did it originally belong to Libertarian Landowners Inc. just because they said so? And like, if this guy is on the land, like, how do you get rid of this guy? What if the guy says, no, I want, what if he calls up the individual that bought the land, that has the title, that has the contract, calls up Libertarian Landowners Inc. and says, you need to get this guy off the fucking property. So then you have to have an enforcement body around that contract. But the guy that's on the property, he didn't agree to that shit. And there's no requirement for him to agree to that stuff. Unless you're going to start building fences everywhere and, laser fences or something to keep all these. I mean, it turns, I think you can see where this is going. While there are some degree of solutions, I think that could be done that allow for a peaceful resolution, there's other solutions that lend itself to tyranny, in my opinion. Because you're going to have an enforcement body around, like, say, contracts and all this different stuff. And contracts, is to some people is like the basis of how, private property would work, in a libertarian paradise. That's how it would be arbitrated, whatever else. Okay, but that enforcement body becomes a really big issue. And this is a huge issue with, lots of people are trying to get into this. Ethereum, BitNation, like there's a ton of blockchain projects that are trying to get into where, they are, they're becoming the contract organization in all this. And so it's like, oh, okay, so you can put your land title on Ethereum. All right, who's enforcing that land title? Ethereum drones? It becomes a huge issue. Like, there aren't exactly answers for that. So that's where I agree with Max Stiner, that with property rights, while he wasn't against them, he didn't have, like I said, he didn't have a hard dogma, or he didn't want them to be a hard dogma, because he envisioned, and I think properly, how they could be used, how property rights could become its own form of tyranny against the individual. This conversation could go on forever, because we could talk about how, what exactly, okay, as long as it's voluntary, right? That's what everybody gets all hot and bothered about. Hey, well, if they signed it, that's it. It's over. They turned it over. What define coercion? Like, define voluntary. Like like manipulation. When does that come into play? There's a lot. There's a whole. Libertarians and ANCAPs try to make the stuff so cut and dry. They try to think, well, it's simple. It's simple. When these things are incredibly complex, and often, really, the only way you can handle any situation is case by case. You can disagree with me. That's okay. I don't mind if people disagree with me. All right? But I'm just saying that there's, a lot of things that I hear as far as being solutions that doesn't sound very free to me. That doesn't sound very voluntary to me. Or I can see where it wouldn't exactly be voluntary. And in those cases, it becomes very problematic. I mean, let me describe this. So, like I said, I self-describe as an egoist anarchist, just because it's the best term around, that I can run with. And I don't really have. There was a time where I would have called myself an anarcho-capitalist, I suppose. I don't really necessarily have a problem with a lot of the basic tenets of anarcho-capitalism. My problem with anarcho-capitalism is, first off, is the solutions that get laid out. I think they're terrible. I really haven't heard any good ones. Not really. For okay, well, how do we handle things in a stateless society? Every book that I've read, and I've read most of them, especially from ANCAPs, including lesser-known authors that are moronic, the solutions are horrendous. They're terrible. They are just set up for exploitation, which is exactly what people say is the problem with capitalism, is that it exploits. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, honestly, even under anarcho-capitalism, even though they say, well, no, you can have blah, 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 you can do this under anarcho-capitalism, it's all going to be fine, blah, blah, woo, paradise. Even though they say that, it's so set up for exploitation. And honestly, when you look at so many of the people, not all, I know lots of great people that call themselves anarcho-capitalists. I really do. But the people that have any kind of, say, mouthpiece, they're scum. They are the scum of the fucking earth, or they're just stupid. I don't know many of them that I have a whole lot of respect for. I mean, they are so bad. You read their posts and it's like, wow. Or even follow them on social media and the trauma's on display. It's like you're telling people how to act when, if we ever get to a stateless society, you're saying this is how things should be, or you could do this, or you could do that. And baby, you don't have shit figured out. And it's so readily apparent that you don't. It's so bad. So, anarcho-capitalism at its base level, I guess, is fine. I'm not saying that it's the best system out there, but okay. But the people, the solutions that get talked about, oh, fuck that. Don't sign me up to be associated with those assholes. Oof. So, anyway, I would, I got in a bit of a tirade. I would not describe Max Stirner as a libertarian. Libertarianism owes Max Stirner a debt. Not like an actual debt. They don't have to give him any gold or Bitcoin. Okay, not that they could. But libertarianism is certainly a step on the shoulders that is Max Stirner. That is the ego in its own. And all that said, and I think I talked about this at the end of last week's Sex and Science Hour. I worry because in my opinion, there are a lot of people that absolutely do not get the ego in its own. They do not get egoism. They do not get Max Stirner. I don't know if they only read half the book or what happened, but they are missing the boat, all the way. I mean, they really are. Now, if you want me to quickly, I guess, get into what exactly, I mean, this is what I got into, and we got some email about it. Because the way I described, how would I describe egoist anarchism? How would I describe what Max Stirner is pushing? I tried to make it as short as I could, but it's practically impossible to make it really short. And it might not sound pretty or appealing in very short form. There's a reason the ego in its own is such a massive tome. It's such a huge book. It's because there's so much to cover. You have to break down all the spooks, which spooks are spooks are effectively saying, no, this isn't rooted in science or reality. This doesn't actually exist. Government is a spook. Religion is a spook. all kinds of things. There's lots of people that honestly are spooks in a very real way, or at least what they espouse is what they say spooky. So you have the concept of spooks. You have the union of egoists, which the union of egoists is that you have a common goal, okay, or a shared goal that you're trying to achieve with other people, okay. And if at any point, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a goal, but maybe you have a shared standard that you're uplifting, that you're promoting, that you're wanting to live. But here's the rub: is that anybody has to be able to leave that at any given time with no consequence. Like they need to be able to leave that intact, and then the union is broken thereafter. Okay, this is kind of the thing. This gets back to like some ideas for blockchains, where people are like, oh yeah, we want to make digital citizenship and all this different stuff. And it's like, okay, well, what if I want to move from Ethereum to another blockchain? Can I take my stuff over? Or will we end up like with what happened with Ripple, where when somebody wants to cash out and it's a whole lot of money, no, you're going to crash the system. We can't let you do that, buddy. Sorry. You can't just leave. And so then, blockchain or digital citizenship becomes, again, it becomes kind of its own little tyranny, right? Because you can't just walk away, even if it's private and voluntary. That becomes problematic. So the union of egoists is so important to study. And I think any form of anarchism can make use of that. You don't have to be an egoist, to take advantage of the union of egoists. In fact, I did a write-up about this on zog.ninja on my website at one point. Like Elon Musk, not that I want to give him any credit, but he was talking about how he thinks businesses should be set up and all this. And his idea for the best way a business to run was effectively a union of egoists. And other people have kind of said that, have espoused similar ideas. Sociocracy, some others, where it's kind of a union of egoists and all this. So that's a great idea. That's something that you can take anywhere. So you have the spooks, you have union of egoists. Oh man, there's like so many different concepts to get into. But at the base level, and this is what I said on Section Science Hour that some people emailed about, and I'll just kind of address it here. Again, I was trying to be short, so you can't really get into the nitty-gritty of what everything means. But effectively, egoist anarchism is just saying, look, the individual is the thing that matters. Everything else is absolutely secondary. All that matters is the ineffable, the individual, and what that is. Okay, so nations don't matter. Your religion doesn't matter. Your morals, honestly, don't matter. And it's true, morality. Where is morality in science? I mean, yeah, there's things like empathy in science, sure. Like, rats have empathy. I mean, you can go down that sort of stuff. But like, where is the idea, where is various morality, or where is like the concept of rights? Like the right to bear arms. What are you talking about? Like, where in science is it that, what is the scientific proof that you have the right to a gun or a sword? There is no scientific, that right doesn't exist. Okay, I'm not saying it's I'm not saying it's an evil thing. I'm just saying that, let's be clear here, it is like money, to where it's something that everybody's just sort of agreeing upon, or at least some people are agreeing upon. But it's not something that if you were, 2-3 people stranded on a desert island, the rest of humanity was gone or something like that, like, okay, where does the right come from? To where like you absolutely must have a gun or something, or not that you must have, but you know what I mean. Or like even privacy, like what is the scientific basis for that? Now, I mean, you can say that privacy is better off, the ability to have privacy is great for the human condition, sure, but where is the concept that humans must have this, or you get to start shooting and offing other people? Right? Because that's the ultimate end of rights infringement. Where is that? It doesn't exist. That's why you have to base rights on God, or some people like to base it on humanity. But again, where in your biological code, does it say I am guaranteed this? It's not there. I'm not saying they're bad ideas. They're great ideas. Yes, I think people should have the liberty of privacy. I don't like to use the word rights. I think people should have the liberty to own whatever property, that they can get their hands on, whatever. Okay, if that ends up being a gun or something like that, fine. That's a property issue. Okay? All these different things. I think they're great, but let's be clear that, it's a human construct. It's not a part of the universe. Okay, and so that's what Max Stirner is getting at when he talks about spooks and all these other things, or when he talks about how there shouldn't be property rights, or not that there shouldn't be, but that, property rights, be careful with those. Or when he talks about like there is no morality. Right, there isn't. Like the universe doesn't have a government, to tell people what to do, or, I mean, like there's... Oh, it's such a see what I mean? It's so tough to kind of talk about this, but I hope you get my point. Now, that doesn't mean you're a nihilist either. That just means that you're, to some degree, I hate to use this term because that's what everybody says whenever they say they're not this. Okay, but you are being a realist in that, no, there is, like, you can't measure the right to privacy scientifically. Okay, so it doesn't exist. Anyway, so, that's where that sort of thing comes in. And I'm going into overtime. I don't want to spend too much longer on this. So, but my description is that Max Stirner, egoist anarchism is effectively that might is right. Okay. Meaning that whatever the individual can do, he can do. But, and this is where I think people forget, is they don't read what Max Stirner has to say about love. Because he talks about how I feel, and he's describing empathy, whether he realizes it or not. I feel what my brother feels. I feel not literally, or not like some kind of quantum entanglement, but just in the fact that you have empathy. You know what another human feels. Okay, that's as long as you still have empathy anyway, which I think anybody can work those muscles. So you don't want to hurt another human because that's how you want to be treated, right? It's the golden rule or the platinum rule, whichever one you want to run with. I like the platinum rule a little bit better. So yeah, might is right, but at the same time, might is, like I said, tempered by love and empathy. Okay, and that's how you empower the individual. Now, you can do unions of egoists all you want that have perhaps little rules or little agreed upon ideas or whatever that go beyond that in how individuals are going to treat each other. Okay, but at the very base level, you have this very simple individual. You really do have a simplicity in that the individual is everything. You are the most important thing in the universe, but so am I. We're equally, because we're individuals, we're equally, all of valid import. And you can treat each other as such. Okay, so, because you hear might is right and you start freaking out. It's like, wait, what the fuck is this? What are you talking about? Oh, this is terrible. So the government's legitimate? Not at all. The government is absolutely illegitimate. The individual is the only thing that's legitimate. Okay? So, but then you got, we have the problem where people are reenacting traumas, and all this different stuff to where they don't treat themselves or other individuals in the way that, that is most effective most effective for human growth and for human happiness, which happiness is the ultimate goal, which is another huge part of what Max Stirner has to say. So, and that's not like a utilitarian argument necessarily, even though utilitarianism has a really bad rap as well, that people don't understand when they read Bentham or Mill. They don't quite get the nuance of what they were talking about when they talk about utilitarianism. Not saying I'm a utilitarianist or whatever whatever you want to call that. But again, it all comes down to the fact that a lot of people really just know this stuff or know of these ideas or think of these terms, and they know it based upon how someone else analyzed it and not based upon their own research. That goes true for Max Stirner. That goes true for all, like I just mentioned, maybe even Bentham and Mill or Nietzsche, or I mentioned Michel Onfray earlier. A bunch of people, like, they never actually read, or they never read Marx. Or, I said this in a recent Patreon episode. It's like, look, there's really more than one communism. Guess what? I know you want to lump it all up into one, but just like how there's a bunch of different ways that capitalism gets used, and some of those, anarcho-capitalists would say is improper, right? Like there's crony capitalism. Well, guess what? There's crony communism. Okay, not everybody agrees with Marx. There's lots of communists who more, are in the camp of, Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin, which Kropotkin's work is phenomenal. I mean, a lot of what he has to say, I hope every capitalist reads that shit and takes it to heart, because he's right in a lot of what he has to say, and how we treat each other as humans and all of this. So, there's multiple forms of that, but most people don't know. They just think, communist. Give me a break. And I'm not even a communist, but that doesn't mean I'm not intrigued by what these people actually think. Instead of just listening to, and with all due respect, because I love her work, instead of just listening to, looking at it all through the lens of Ayn Rand, or through the lens of Rothbard, or through the lens of Woods, or some other dipshit. I mean, if you want to trust them, fine. But guess what? You might find out that people think differently than the way that some of these other versions of anarchism get parlayed. Like that they don't know. Actually, they don't subscribe to the way that Woods describes it, or the way that Rothbard describes it, or the way that, even Mises describes it. Even though Mises is, a lot of socialists actually really like Mises. I bet you didn't know that. They do. But anyway, I've gone on too long with this. So, question everything. That's the order of the day. Question everything. I hope that kind of explains it. Yeah. So, I mean, just again in brief, Max Stirner, not a libertarian. Yes, libertarians have learned a lot from him. Just like Herbert Spencer, I really don't think he's a libertarian. Not the libertarianism that Americans talk about. Libertarianism originally, in its original use, was actually a term for communists. It was not a term for capitalists. So you could say there may be more libertarians in that way, but again, Stirner, as much as even some of Stirner's fans say to the opposite, Stirner wasn't espousing any kind of culture, any kind of economy, really. He was just saying, look, you have to hold up the individual and the individual alone, the ineffable one, and that being you particularly. So there you have it. I hope I explained that in some kind of fashion that made sense for you. But you can ask more specific questions if you want. And please, if you disagree with anything I'm saying, message me. Okay? Maybe you can change my mind. I actually have a very open mind. Okay? That's why I'm willing to read books from people that are part of either economic persuasions or philosophical persuasions that I don't share. As to where, in my opinion, I see a lot of, ANCAPs or libertarians, and they are so fucking closed-minded. And of course, whenever you call them out on it, it's like, well, don't be so open-minded that your brain falls out. To quote another asshat, that is not an argument. And it's not. That's horseshit. So, anyway. And I don't like to quote the person that I just quoted, because not a fan. But anyway, now let's get into... all right, so I'll pull up the question here. And it's, hey, Brian, another question for you. Since you've mentioned it in the past, I wonder if you could talk about hedonism, your definition, what it means to you, how you put it into practice in your everyday life, how you came to it, whatever you feel like discussing. So, and I responded to this person quickly and just said, yeah, I think I'll get to that in a Q&A. And based off of last week's conversation, I think it's a good one to have now as well. But I've promised this for such a long time, and I have, and I think I talked about this in a recent Q&A as well, I have a lot of little episodes that, like, I need to finish, and that I just, that I really want to be very well done. I want them to be very well laid out. Things that you could potentially, in the future, at first they'd be Patreon content, or at the very least, you yourself could take the information and talk to other people about it. Like, I want kind of complete cases made. Not just simple 20 minutes on a podcast or something like that, but like full, like almost a course on a subject. Okay, and one of the ones I've wanted to do for a long time that I've worked on, I have, quite a bit of it done, and I keep wanting to add more, and I really want to like address the critics, with it and all that, without having to really do another episode on it or something. And the one is hedonism, because probably people say this kind of shit all the time, but I have, other than unfortunate times where I fell to the lure of religion, which I won't let happen again. Done a little too much work on myself to make sure of that. My whole life I've been a hedonist. Before I, self-described as many other isms, even anarchist and all that. I've been a hedonist, and so it's a subject that I really it deserves such a great exploration, and it's so hard to find great explorations of it in the English language, quite frankly. There are other philosophers, and I mean that in the abstract term, not in the specific, like referencing to a bunch of idiots at FDR or something. That have covered it perhaps far better than I ever could. But I'm not the best person to translate their work by any means. So the person, here is asking me about hedonism. What's my definition of it? What do I mean by it? How do I apply it? Blah, 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 blah. So I am going to touch on this subject. I am going to get into it here. And this is not going to be like a complete case by any means. That is something I am working on and I'd like to release in the future. But I am going to describe it. Now, why don't we start with definitions, okay? And I'll rock Wikipedia on this one, because I think their definition is fine and dandy of, the overall meaning of hedonism. Because it is important to say that a lot of people have a lot of different definitions of what exactly hedonism means. Okay, there is a hedonism that has to do with technology, which I'm not saying I'm opposed to, but that's not what I mean when I talk about hedonism. Like, there's the idea that we build medicine, or that we create medicines, or drugs, or we create technologies or something else to where you literally remove the human capacity for feeling pain. That is one definition of hedonism. That is not the one that I subscribe to. Okay, and I'm not saying I am opposed to those people. I'm not saying I'm really for them either. All right, but you gotta understand that, like so many isms, capitalism, communism, environmentalism, even a lot of these different things, there are a bunch of different meanings, even ones that some people think is pure, that I talked about many times and have proven that it's not. Voluntarism or voluntarism, whichever way you want to say it. Okay, there are people who call themselves voluntarists that vote. The person that invented the term, Karl Wagner, said that electoral politics have no part in voluntarism. So obviously you have two voluntarisms. So it's really important with in fact, this is kind of fitting to mention him. What did Socrates say? That the beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms? This is true. Okay, and so I'm happy to describe, even briefly here in this Q&A, what I mean by hedonism. All right, but I want you to know that yes, there are a lot of people use the term hedonism for all kinds of things, and there's not just one hedonism. I think there's one kind of abstract sort of definition that people say, I don't want to say refine, but that they forge into whatever their own goals are. Okay. But just like, Epicureanism, okay, is a version of hedonism. It is one type of hedonism. It is not the only type of hedonism. So why don't I read the definition here, the abstract definition that I have no issue with, and this is directly from Wikipedia. Hedonism is a school of thought that argues that pleasure and happiness are the primary or most important intrinsic goods in the proper aim of human life. A hedonist strives to maximize net pleasure minus pain. So let's be clear on what exactly, like how could people twist like such a simple definition? Or not twist, but use such a simple abstract as what we just read, okay? Now, there are people who So, like, take Epicureanism, okay? Which I don't, if somebody called me an Epicurean, I wouldn't take much umbrage with that. I don't think that it exactly describes me perfectly, though Epicurus was brilliant, and there's definitely a lot of what he had to say through a hedonist lens that was so far ahead of his time that it makes you wonder. I'm not going to tell you what it makes you wonder, but it makes you wonder. But okay, so Epicureanism, like that version of hedonism, is not the idea that is not necessarily debauchery. It is not the idea that you just go out there and you go seek every single passion, fulfill every passion you have at any given moment, and devil may care, right? All that. Okay, that's not what Epicureanism says or espouses as a hedonistic philosophy. What it espouses is that you take steps in life to experience the least amount of pain. That is wholly different from going out and seeking a good time. Or, all the wild pleasures and all that. Like, those are two totally fucking different things. But your average run-of-the-mill conservative, or even liberal, or, even your average run-of-the-mill libertarian, but I repeat myself, seemingly on all counts these days, don't seem to understand that. Like, that those are very different things. Now, I'm not opposed to either. Like, I mean, if that's like the life you want to lead is going out and just, fulfilling every single little desire you have, rock and roll. You go for it. I won't judge you for that. You go do your thing. I don't care. Okay? If your goal in life is to minimize pain, go for it, baby. Who would argue with that? Well, I imagine there are people who would. They're called Stoics, but that's not. But we'll save that for a little bit later in this conversation. Okay, all those definitions are really fine, but also neither of those really stand in contrast to the notion that pleasure and happiness are the ultimate goals in life, which, interestingly enough, also Ayn Rand said was the ultimate goal. Of course, she had how do you get to that? And, how you get to that is through productive achievement, living the heroic life and all this, which is in many ways, in my opinion anyway, that's just another form of hedonism in a very real sense. I don't think you could say that capital O objectivism is a hedonism, but I would argue with you that little o objectivism, okay, which, capital O objectivism is, Leonard Peikoff's, all his shit, yay government, if you don't have government, you're just going to get taken over by the next warlord, blah, 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 all that crap, which I don't agree with at all. But the more of the existentialism that is, small O objectivism, a lot of the more, kind of the three axioms that Ayn Rand would espouse, not so much the political stuff. Like, praising IP, which that's nonsense. But, going by the three axioms, existence, identity, all that. A lot of that, I think that's effectively hedonism. I mean, she was really pushing Epicureanism in a very real sense. I mean, she had some other parts that were just crazy, like women can't be in charge or, stuff like this. I mean, it was damned odd, frankly. But so it just brings up my point that under this abstract notion of what hedonism is, okay, which is, again, the school of thought that argues that pleasure and happiness are the primary and most important intrinsic goals and the proper aim of human life, you can come up with all these wild different philosophies or philosophical schools. So keep that in mind, that when somebody says, what do you mean by, when somebody says I'm a hedonist, you need to ask them, well, what do you mean by that? Like, what is your school of hedonism, exactly? So I like this next paragraph in Wikipedia, so I'm going to read that. And it is, ethical hedonism is the idea that all people have the right to do everything in their power to achieve the greatest amount of pleasure possible to them. It is also the idea that every person's pleasure should far surpass their amount of pain. Ethical hedonism is said to have been started by Aristippus of Cyrene, a student of Socrates, who we just mentioned. He held the idea that pleasure is the highest good. Now, there you go. There is the start of what I mean by hedonism, this ethical hedonism, okay? And it plays off very nicely if you listen to last week's Q&A when we talk about what Max Stirner was espousing. This falls right in. with egoism. This idea that your pleasure, you are the most important thing in the universe, right? That's the whole tenet of egoism. Of course, then so is everybody else. So this ethical hedonism is really important. And so I'm going to give a little bit of history, and then I want to talk about personal application and what it means for me and where I first came upon hedonism. In fact, maybe I'll start with that. How did I come upon hedonism? What was my first experience with hedonism? Well, it certainly wasn't from reading Aristippus of Cyrene, nor was it reading, like the Art of Happiness by Epicurus. My first experience, there was a Christian book. The title is escaping me at the moment. I'll admit that. But there was a Christian book that talked about how hedonism, and this is in the 90s, how hedonism was taking over America. And I read this. Now, there were other life forces, other confluences of events that were happening that really, kind of brought me to this. But I read this book as a young Christian, and everything in this book that the author was saying, it was a pastor or some type, that the author was saying was bad. I've shared a picture of this book. Let me see if I can look it up quick. I want to get the title for you. Well, I can't seem to find it. I know I have a digital copy of it because it was kind of such an important book. Unfortunately, I can't remember the exact title of it. But anyway, everything that this guy described in this book that was evil, I was like, wait a second, but that's what I want to do. Like, I want to do that. And like, this is the life I kind of want to lead. Like, it's funny because the book was supposed to scare you and supposed to say, oh, you got to stay with Christ because otherwise you'll end up like this. And I'm like, no, I want to fucking end up like that. And so then I started, and the guy, he talks about Aristippus, he talks about Epicurus, and he talks about some of the opponents too, like Epictetus and some others. And so I start reading all of these people. And, I'm reading Epicurus, and I'm even, not that there's really anything left of Aristippus much anyway, but, what you could find out of like some Greek books. Most of the works you find about Aristippus, you find out through the Nicene and Ante-Nicene fathers. Like it comes from reading either Christian texts that critique, or it comes from like reading Plato or some of these other guys. It usually comes from critiques. You never find the autographs from these guys. Probably because hedonism, in my opinion, and I'm just laying this out here before I even get into, a lot more of hedonism, but probably because hedonism actually sets people free. And philosophers of the past 2,000 years don't want that. Even philosophers today who say, want you to vote for Trump, are all about control. And so they hate hedonism because that's about actually being free. In fact, there's writings of where Aristippus got, I think it's in, Aristotle might have talked about it. But where Aristippus gets in arguments with some of the most popular philosophers of the day, Plato and a bunch of them. And these guys who you think are so logical and cool and collective, right? Plato and whoever else, it's reported that they were just furious over having arguments with Aristippus, but Aristippus was the one who was cool as a cucumber. He was cool as the breeze. That's interesting. Because Plato couldn't win against the philosophy of hedonism. Maybe because a lot of these other guys, oh shit, can't handle that. I mean, and they're all outcrops of Socrates anyway. Aristippus was a student of Socrates. So I read that book, and then I started actually researching the actual thing. And it wasn't necessarily the best foundation of it, especially reading Epicurus, even though The Art of Happiness is a wonderful book in so many ways. And actually Epicurus, as I've said on Sovryn Tech a few times whenever I brought him up, like he keeps kind of getting proven right. Even when you thought that, because Epicurus was an atomist, all into scientific materialism and all that, right? And like a lot of his notions end up being right. Like even the concept, there are new theories out there that the universe actually has no beginning and no end. Like that time has just kind of always been. Epicurus said that. There's other things where, he seems to like get proven right much later on. And of course, that's because finally some people are getting away, from Christianity, or from the stranglehold, shall we say, of religion. So anyway, not the best foundation, but I came back to it because I became a Christian again. I don't want to get into my my whole life story on that again. But after I got out of the military and I finally snapped out of the haze of war, effectively. I came back to hedonism and atheism, which those are, so this is worth bringing up too. Hedonism and atheism are part and parcel. Like they are so intertwined. I could imagine now there's the idea of carnal Christians who think that, because like Romans 9, they get to do whatever the hell they want, and that in fact sinning makes them greater in God's eyes. As long as you keep going for forgiveness, because they misconstrue a quote by the Apostle Paul. I'm not talking about them, but there are Christians who, I think, what's his name? John Piper, who is, I don't even know if he's still alive, a very, very famous Calvinist pastor. And he believes in he has what's called a Christian hedonism, which is the idea that you do everything to the pleasure of Christ. Like everything is for the pleasure of Christ. Ooh. Even when I was Christian and I heard that, I was like, there's something a little off about that. Like, in using that term, because that just doesn't, that's really, and I get it. John Piper was trying to sell books and he was trying to be controversial by using the word hedonist, but those two terms just shouldn't even belong to each other. Not in any way, shape, or form. So hedonism is very much intertwined, with atheism. So as I came to atheism, I think the logical extension of atheism is hedonism, and vice versa, and all this. If I end up losing track here talking, this is such a huge subject, and I'm trying to really boil it down, quickly. But I just want you to know, my point in talking about that was in saying that there are people who claim to be Christian hedonists, but it's not what you think. And even if it is what you think, they are fucking dead wrong. Like by their own translation of their books, they're crazy. So now shift it up. So now I mentioned Aristippus of Cyrene. Now you got to be careful, okay, because there's actually two Aristippuses. There's Aristippi. There's Aristippus of Cyrene, and then there's Aristippus the Younger, okay? And actually in a lot of, and here's where it becomes a problem. You may be able to tell that difference, but historians often, or even more antiquated historians, have a hard time, to where a lot of things that may have actually been said by Aristippus of Cyrene get attributed to Aristippus the Younger, who is the grandson of Aristippus of Cyrene. Aristippus the Younger is the daughter of, is the son of Aristippus of Cyrene's daughter, his daughter being Arete. Now, Arete is, her story alone is phenomenal. You can almost skip the Aristippi and you can go right to Arete, because here, we're talking about a woman in, the 4th century, 3rd, 4th century BCE, who was the writer of 40 books. She was a professional philosopher. And here's the deal. It's not like there weren't other female philosophers, but she made her living off of being one. That was exceptional. Why was that exceptional? How was she able to do that? Well, if you want to equate something, is it because her message resonated with people so much? And here's the problem. We don't really know what her message was. We can only assume that because Aristippus of Cyrene, because her father was kind of the first guy attributed with hedonism, we don't have a whole lot of his writing, so I'm going to mention a couple of things that he said that I think you'll appreciate. Okay, even though you have Aristippus of Cyrene, and since Aristippus the Younger also carried on the hedonist tradition, who we don't have a whole lot of his writings either, other than, we kind of have ideas that he sort of systematized hedonism in a way. You would assume that Aristippus the Younger just learned what was passed down from Aristippus, the elder, to his mother, Arete. So somehow she made a living as a woman doing that. Now, one could argue is that Aristippus, because of his philosophy of hedonism, that pleasure is the ultimate kind of human good, and that all things flow from that, that perhaps he came to a lot of very interesting conclusions, like equality of the sexes, among other things, and so that perhaps that allowed him to be such a tremendous parent that Arete ends up becoming a wild success at a time when women were not to be wild successes. Much like Hypatia, who we learn about later during the Library of Alexandria. Even up to Hypatia's day, it was still rare for a woman, to be a teacher and to be a philosopher. And unfortunately, we know what happened to Hypatia. Burned alive, dragged out into the streets and who knows what else, stoned, perhaps burned alive, as the Library of Alexandria was destroyed by various religious zealots. So, you look at these lives and you have to wonder how big a part is, one would argue that philosophy, says everything about one's life. And so, what do you have here that comes out of that? And, well, I think it's interesting to look at the lives of these people. But anyway, so Arete is a success story in and of herself. And perhaps it speaks to the success of the philosophy of hedonism itself. And I'm being very short here. I'm not going really, really deep on a lot of this, folks. So if you're going to say I'm doing some kind of fallacy, go ahead and tell me, and maybe I'll address it quick, because I'm not. Okay, I have a lot more that I could say based on everything. I could do an hour. I could do 4 hours on every single name that I brought up so far. Okay, I'm trying to be quick here. I'm trying to keep it condensed. So anyway, let's talk. Let's go to Aristippus of Cyrene, who is arguably the guy that kind of started this whole shtick. One of my favorite quotes from Aristippus of Cyrene is, "Wise people, even though all laws were abolished, would still lead the same life." Now, that's a very popular quote, just particularly on the internet, which makes a lot of sense, because especially the early internet, which was very anarchistic. And that's as anarchist as it gets, saying that, look, laws don't make men, laws don't make society, laws don't make civilization. Wisdom does, knowledge does. Or how about this one? "A wise man's country is the world." I've got a whole list here. These are just, these are beautiful, beautiful quotes. "It is better to be a beggar than ignorant, for the beggar only wants money, but an ignorant person wants humanity." Ooh, what does that mean? Anyway, you could go on and on with Aristippus's life. Just wild, some wild stories to be had, where he's seemingly a very clever guy. And it's funny because he gets written about mainly by his detractors, and the detractors missed that he was ripping on them right and left, and he was making fools and asses of them. It's really quite the thing. So now that doesn't mean that Aristippus also wasn't a guy that, went about enjoying extravagance and courtesans and, all this other stuff. There's some things that were laid against him that I think were completely inaccurate. And you could tell kind of within the writing, say by some of these, some of his philosophical enemies, that they were trying to do a smear piece. But then, between the lines, you could see where there was the truth of it. So Aristippus is an interesting character to look at as far as coming up with a lot of this stuff, and was certainly a lot of thought in the ancient world. Again, most of these writings are, we talked about the Library of Alexandria, and it wasn't just the Library of Alexandria, you have the Library of Pergamum, you have tons of them, where a lot of these writings are just lost and they're gone. And you can kind of see why maybe, some people get conspiratorial around the Library of Alexandria because it spoke against the power of the day, and that people might soon figure out, holy shit, perhaps everybody would become anarchists, who knows? Or something like that. I'm kind of transposing some of my own ideas on them. Certainly, I can admit to that my bias may be creeping in. Okay, but hedonism in and of itself is anti-power, at least power over the individual. It is power for the individual, but it is power. It is against power that stands against the individual. Saying, even the power, not just government, but even the power of like social mores, which I talk about all the time, to where hedonism's like, okay, well, yeah, no, that's something you want to do. you can do it. As long as you can do it. You know, don't go using anybody else's shit, but as long as you can do it, do it. As to where, you know, a lot of social mores would say, no, you don't do that. You can't just go butt fuck somebody. Are you kidding me? That's terrible. That's horrendous. That's against God. Yada, 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 yada. And maybe that's in some ways, you know, the way hedonism is best understood is in contrast to a lot of its detractors and a lot of its opposition. Perhaps the most popular opposition. Now, I want to get into. I want to get into. I guess I should see. I'm all over the place. You can see why I was doing a 2-hour show about this. Okay, I want to get into kind of how I apply it in my own life. That was something that was described, what exactly it means for me and all that. I do want to get into that. But I want to just discuss like that there's some people who say, well, you know, what about the Stoics? Because Stoicism seems to be a very popular thing in libertarianism and anarchism these days. I don't know why, but it is. Now, here's the thing. Here's the primary thing to understand about Stoicism. Okay, and I've read Epictetus. I know the works. Okay, here's the primary thing that people miss, is that Stoicism says to you that your actions today, what you do today, like that you need to think about the future. You need to think about tomorrow. Not just tomorrow as in literally 24 hours from now. You need to think about when you're gone and how you're going to affect the world. In Stoicism, there is this kind of inherent idea that you owe something to the future, that it behooves you, more than it behooves you, it is the proper way to live, that say you leave the world a better place than when you came into it. Now, I'm not saying that that's a bad idea, but what I am saying is that there is absolutely there's no, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, there's no rule, there's no law, there's no part of your biological code that says you are required as a human being to make sure that the world is better as you go. Where is that? Like, tell me the science behind that. Like, so I mean, give me the scientific principle, break out your scientific method, show me where exactly it says that you are required as a human being, that this is part of your human makeup, to be a good human being, whatever the fuck that means, that you have to make the world a better place. No, it's not there. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying it doesn't exist. Stoicism is a philosophy, like that is one of the undercurrents of Stoicism, and that's horseshit. Now, does human pleasure exist? Oh, fuck yeah. What do you think you have all these sensory organs for? It is a part of the biological makeup of who you are. You could say pain is as well. I understand that, but then that becomes the choice. That becomes where the human creature goes beyond instinct and says, "Do I want more pleasure or do I want more pain?" Or is there something, you know, intermixed there, perhaps for some people? You know, kind of the quantum existence of human beings. There is nothing in Stoicism that, I mean, it has no scientific bearing whatsoever. As for hedonism, has a shit ton. Now, can we move on beyond our biology and all that? Sure, of course we can. That's why we have choice. You can choose to live a Stoic life. That's fine. But you can't say, I agree with Stoicism, so then I'm going to pick up some stupid fucking book that says, oh, I'm an R-type or I'm a K-type, you know, human being, and that, you know, this fits right in with my philosophy and all that, and this is biological, this is how you make things successful, okay? This is how civilization goes on, because once we're Stoics, civilization moves on. Well, here's your problem. Here's your next problem. Not even getting into the biology of the matter. Okay, here's your problem with your Stoicism and your problem with really almost any other philosophy outside of hedonism. You can choose it, that's fine. But when you start saying that that's how you have a great civilization is when you apply these little personal philosophical rules, and this personal philosophy and all that, writ large, that somehow everything's okay. Guess what? History is not on your side. You do not find Stoicism. You do not find a lot of conservatism or a lot of these other ideas. You don't find them at the very start of civilization, which I would think your argument that somehow these are what saved civilization would preclude that. Well, what exactly at, say, the first civilizations we know of in human history, that being, say, Sumer, right, the Sumerians, or ancient Egypt or something, do you find these things there? At the very start of, these very real quantum leaps in human existence, coming out of the Paleolithic into the Neolithic and all this. What do you find? You don't find Stoicism. You don't find a lot of these other philosophies, but you do find hedonism. Oddly enough. Here's one of the first quotes out of Sumer. Okay, and it's right out of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I know I've been wanting to release the Epic of Gilgamesh for a while, but I've yet to. Anyway, there's a character in it, Siduri, who gives the following advice. Quote, "Fill your belly day and night, make merry, let days be full of joy, dance and make music day and night. These things alone are the concern of men." I mean, that's fucking hedonism in a nutshell. Enjoy life. Your life. Now. You. Not the life of the next people. Look, this is something where I think Ayn Rand was so spot on. Okay? She said, when I die, it's not my life that will end, but the world will end. And that's absolutely true. And what she means by that is, it's over. When you're dead, you have nothing to do with the world. It's done and done. The world for you has effectively ended. It's not you that will die. It is the world that will end. That was Ayn Rand's point. And I think that's so true. You don't owe the future anything. You can choose to, but there's no grand law, and there's no evidence whatsoever historically that somehow if you engage in anything other than constantly thinking about the future and having a family, doing all this shit, blah 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 blah, that somehow things are going to end up so much worse. I would argue quite the opposite, because the anti-hedonism philosophies have been the ones that have really kind of carried on through time. Why did they carry on? Well, because all the hedonist books got burned. But they're the ones that have carried on through time. And you want to tell me that, wow, how wonderful this is, blah, 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 blah. I would argue with you that what really happened is that, say, during the Enlightenment, what happened during the Enlightenment was suddenly people started, so you had scientists that the kind of the purpose behind the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and all this was, all right, we have this incredible tool called science that we're discovering, and this consistency of existence in the universe. And so we're going to take that and we are going to, we're going to start applying it. How can we prove God? And of course, what happened is they found out they disproved God during the Enlightenment. Okay, and they started, when they started using the scientific method here, there, and everywhere, okay, suddenly they started saying, wait a second, what about this whole individualism thing? Because that's when a lot of this shit starts to crop up, is at the same time. Any of the advancements you have today, okay, that you think are good, really kind of came out of a lot of those varying thinkers. Okay, say anywhere between the 12th or, I guess maybe 13th to, say, 17th century, something like this, right? Okay, but those people, those ideas were, very individualistic, and honestly, a lot of them were very hedonistic. I mean, you look at, the monks of Mendenham, Hellfire, things like the Hellfire Club and stuff like this, where people were, allowing their passions to finally get expressed. I'm reminded... Well, I'll quote Nathaniel Branden to you, speaking of Ayn Rand, but I think Nathaniel Branden's right. This is the guy who's the expert on self-esteem, and just if you've never read his books, fucking read them. But he has one of the best quotes in history, in my opinion, and that is that in order to think clearly, we have to feel deeply. That is hedonism. You have to feel these things. You don't bury them. You don't shove them off for tomorrow. Okay? You feel them. And then you can think clearly because you're paying attention to what's going on for you. And I know there's people who say, well, Stoicism doesn't say bury it. Stoicism doesn't say go around walking around like Mr. Spock or something. Yeah, I get that. But you create false paradigms with Stoicism. You really do. And I have so much more I want to get into. I'm going to try and wrap this up. You create false paradigms. Like there's the idea of instant gratification. That is such a false paradigm. People do not, I mean, maybe there's some people that go after instant gratification, but that term gets used way too much. All right. When people want something now, it doesn't have to do with the fact that they can't control their lust or they can't control their passion. It's because they want a guarantee in a world where everything gets taken out from underneath them by thieves. Have you ever thought about it that way? It's not, yeah, there's such a thing as instant gratification and people not being able to delay gratification or something like this. Okay, but it gets applied across the board, and it's wrong to apply that way. There's times where it needs to be applied, but most of the ways that people think about it, absolutely fucking not. And it's so funny because like now a lot of these people that are against sort of like some of the ideas that I've laid out with hedonism or hedonism in general that perhaps that you would read about, and I know I haven't exactly described what it is, but it's just so funny that so many people that are against this sort of shit, now they appeal to biology. Like they bring up a lot of this R-type and R, this RK selection theory and all this bullshit. When it's like, these same people will tell you, like they're part of, say, like the no FAP movements, right? Where you don't jerk off. And all this stuff, right? And it's like, well, okay, wait a second. Let's see. Biologically, a person can come, like a man can ejaculate every 5 minutes to an hour. And they can ejaculate millions of billions of sperm. So biologically, what are they designed to do? Well, obvious. They're designed to come a lot. So what the fuck is this nonsense about, not fapping? Woo. Woo. Anyway, so hedonism for me, let's boil, now that I'm done railing against the opposition, I think I should reverse the order of how I'm talking about this. But hedonism for me is just that, is just what Aristippus talked about, what Ayn Rand talked about, what a lot of these different, characters or philosophers, people talked about, that, happiness is your number one goal. Now, like Max Stiner said, is that or even, here, I'll quote Robert Heinlein. What is love? Love is your happiness completely intertwined with someone else's. So, and Stirner was, huge on feeling love. And that is that, your happiness does not, your actual happiness, your ethical hedonism does not fuck with someone else's pursuit of happiness. Is that the nap, right? Something like that? It's not exactly the nap, but that's the thing. Do what, or what, who says that? The Wiccans? Do what thou wilt, just don't hurt anybody, but hurt none, right? Isn't that how they say it? Sure, that's great. That's a perfect way to describe hedonism. That's certainly how, how I chalk up hedonism. Of course, what does hurt mean? Well, that's another conversation. Okay, but, that's it. That's really it. And that seeking out these pleasures. Now, how does that, so there's hedonism for you. Is that pleasure is the intrinsic good. It is the ultimate good. It is the ultimate goal in life. It is, pleasure. Pleasure can take a lot of different forms. Pleasure could be a chocolate chip cookie. Pleasure could be a cum. Pleasure could be a threesome. Pleasure could be a scientific discovery. Pleasure could be a boat ride. Pleasure could be, obviously it could be all these different things, right? Okay. It's not just about living some kind of debaucherous, gluttonous life or whatever. I don't have any problem with living that kind of life. Okay. But it's not just that. Writing a book is a tremendous pleasure. That's hedonism. That's okay. Hedonism is telling you effectively that when society says to you, as a whole, that just because society agrees upon something being a really terrible or evil thing, like how anal sex used to be considered the unspeakable act, hedonism says, no, it's not. As long as there's consent, actual consent, and as long as you're rocking it, because that would be part of, that would be part of the happiness, right? Is, intertwining it with someone else's experience. Okay? Rock and roll. Have a good time. Enjoy yourself. Call me in the morning if you want. And so how do I apply that in my own life? I hope I kind of described it. I mean, I think the abstract definition that Wikipedia gave was actually fantastic. How do I apply it in my own life? I don't listen to the societal mores. And I listen to myself. What do I want? How would I want to be treated? Right? Kind of like the platinum rule or the golden rule, depending on which way you want to rock with it. I look at that, and there is, when I'm in touch with my pleasure, I can be more in touch with what I want out of life and how to respect other people. Because when I'm in touch with every aspect, all of my passions, all of my desires, all of my discipline, when I'm actually in touch with that, when I'm feeling deeply so I can think clearly, then I can better know how to respect other people as well. So that's one of the ways that it gets applied. It gets applied by, I don't believe in other people like ruling over me. Because their pleasure isn't any greater than mine. Unless I choose it to be, and I don't. I mean, now, do I go around drinking? Do I go around, doing all these other things? No. And I don't mind that people do. I don't care. Drink, do drugs, do all the drugs you want. I don't give a shit. Okay. Duh. We're talking hedonism. Go ahead. I am not here to lay down social mores on you. Okay, but I don't do any of that stuff. Now, interestingly, the reason I don't do that is because, in my opinion, just my opinion, the individual here, me, Golden Stallion, Brian Sovryn, they interfere with my ability to feel pleasure. I mean, and there's, I have science to kind of to back that up. Okay, I have research that can back that up. That whiskey dick, right? You have stoner boner. These are actual conditions that people get, when they imbibe or ingest or smoke up, whatever, or even cigarettes themselves. Can affect blood vessels and the penis and all this. And I don't want that. Because I've chosen where one of my great vehicles of pleasure, okay, and I don't want to mess with it. That's it. But do you see how seeking pleasure actually created, to some degree, for lack of a better term, a discipline? In that I'm not going to do that stuff because I know what I want, because I have felt deeply and I have thought about it clearly because I felt it. So that's how it applies. Hedonism says nothing. In the abstract, hedonism says really nothing about making sure you're going out and having a party. It's just saying that if you want to, you can. As to where other philosophies are saying, that might not be a good idea. Based upon the philosophy telling you that. Hedonism, you get the opportunity to tell yourself that. You get the opportunity to explore yourself over that because you're not writing off your passions. You see. Now, I know I'm getting like all kind of hot and bothered and heated up and everything. Understand, emailer, I love your question. I told you that. Like, I just, what really comes up for me, when I start talking about hedonism is the reasons that I cling so much to it, because so much of society tells you that so many of your passions, from the simplest passion of eating a chocolate chip or, of eating a peanut butter whoopie pie, to the larger passions of being in an orgy or something, are wrong. So it gets me heated up. Anyway, I kind of hope that answered the question. Like I said, this is something that I've wanted to do, like just a huge episode around, going more into the history of it. But I tried to be very brief and tried to describe a lot of this stuff for you. And I hope it helps. I hope it's what you're looking for. I apply it by accepting my passions and then being able to look at them, instead of just writing them off because society tells me they're bad or because the country I happen to live in thinks that it's bad, or something like this, like that. That's how hedonism can get applied. Do I have say debaucherous sexual adventures. I certainly have. But I don't but they're my experience. And I personally make sure, because it's just as important to me having a good time, that everybody else is having a good time when I'm rocking that shit too. You see how logically hedonism plays in? It's amazing. Do I want the future to be a better place than the world I live in now? Absolutely, because that's the world I want to live in. I want to live in a better world. Now, I don't plan on dying, of course, either. I think, transhumanism's a thing. Not exactly the transhumanism that most people describe, but regardless, I do that simply not out of some like stoic desire to, oh yes, the world must be better when I leave it. Or I need to think about tomorrow. It's not that. It's just that that's what I'd want to live in. So I'm trying to create it right now. That is my debaucherous desire, is to have a peaceful planet. Oh, how terrible. Oh. You don't need to have this. You don't need to feel a need or to have some kind of philosophy telling you need to be worried about tomorrow to have a better tomorrow. And that's one, that was one of the big pulls to me for anarchism, is that, it was that great crucible of truth where you hammered everything out and you got rid of all the non-essentials. And you struck the root, right? You strike the root. And what's left when you get to the root, and what can grow from that root when you finally realize what it is? That's exciting. That's the stuff but you got to get to that point. You've got to, and you've got to have that basis. You cannot just be constantly stepping back, okay, from, say, if you were a Republican or a Democrat or whatever, and you're just constantly like a little bit, okay, yeah, no, I'm like this. Oh, now I'm like this. Eventually you got to get to the point where it's like, okay, look, I think, all of these different philosophies or ideologies or whatever, they were, there's something off about all of them. And so I'm going to get to the root of this, and then I'm going to go from there. And that's what anarchism for me was all about. That was, I think, in my opinion, and I think there's actually a lot of evidence in what scant writings have survived because authoritarians burned it all, okay? What scant evidence survives is that hedonism in and of itself is anarchism. They are one and the same, and there's other people you can read. I've mentioned his name a few times. There's Michel Onfray, who does work on this. There's a few others out there. As I tried to connect, Max Stiner, I think, effectively, espouses hedonism. So there you have it. I'm going to leave it. I'm just going to leave it at that. And if people have more particular questions, or if you disagree with me, please go ahead, disagree. Tell me your disagreement, and I will discuss it. All right? And especially if you're a Sovryn Tech listener, look, I don't hate you. Okay? Just like this listener was asking, tell me, what do you think about hedonism? Well, they're just asking the question. I got, heated up, but I wasn't heated up as a listener. Go ahead, tell me. Instead of walking away, and saying, this guy is crazy, why don't you try having the conversation?
You just experienced Sovryn Tech. Go to sovryntech.com, that's SOVRYN tech.com, and connect with us there. Find links from today's show and catch our podcast feed. Sovryn Tech is copy heart. Copying art is an act of love, and love is not subject to law. So please share the show however you like. Welcome to the evolution.